And we are live with the NewsWhip Pulse on the wonderful Friday the 13th, 2020. How is your day going, Ben?
It's good. What could go wrong? It's Friday the 13th of 2020. It really couldn't be any more portentous. But yeah, it's going well so far. Thank you. Still a
Great.
long way to go in the US yet.
Yeah, the sun is starting to set in Ireland, and I haven't seen any volcanoes or earthquakes yet. So we're in a very safe part of the world when it comes to those things, though. Um, Well, so I'm Paul Quigley. I'm joined with Benedict Nicholson. We're both from NewsWhip. This is the NewsWhip Pulse, and as promised, this is going to be a very special election edition of the NewsWhip Pulse. We're going to kind of be drilling into three specific areas today, and doing so with a view to getting as much insight and useful information as we can packed into our 30 minutes with you. We will be making sure there's time for some questions in the last, let's say, 6 minutes, maybe slightly more. This stuff is topical, and we may budget a few more minutes at the end for questions and discussion. Please put those into the chat, and Danielle will tee them up to me and Ben to answer. So first of all, Ben, the three topics we said we'd focus on today is misinformation, um, and the misinformation about the election, the 2020 narratives, like what actually dominated, what were people sharing, and
Yep.
do we have misconceptions about what those were? And then the last item, the polling notably was off. How does that contrast with the social data, and what is the role for social data versus polling kind of data when you're trying to understand the public's interests in a topic? So
Exactly.
great. Well, look, let's dive right in on the first thing, Ben. I what we talked about before is maybe comparing 2016, which famously is when misinformation started appearing as a problem and
Mm.
people became aware of it, especially after the election result, versus 2020. So,
Yeah,
take us on a journey.
I will do. Yeah. So as you say, 2016 is kind of known as the misinformation election. I think certainly when people became aware of it and it started happening on a mass scale. I think there'd always been, rumors and half truths that had abounded in the traditional media before that. But I think 2016 is when it went viral, for lack of a better term. So I just wanted to share my screen and we can look a little bit at that. So this is looking at, can you see this okay?
Great. If
Cool.
you
This is,
present mode, we'll see it even
yeah,
better.
let's do that. So this is looking at the articles about Hillary Clinton in 2016 that were the most engaged of any in the 3 months before the election. So if you look at this, you cannot see very many articles from traditional news sites. So madworldnews.com, yellowhammernews.com, endingthefed.com, nevo.news, all of these were very highly viral articles for the time. These numbers don't look so big now, as we'll see in a minute, but you can see these are really articles that look at Hillary Clinton from a non-mainstream perspective, and even the ones that are kind of mainstream. So you see like the Chicago Tribune in here saying Democrats should ask Clinton to step aside. So there was never this groundswell of support from the mainstream media or looking at fact-checking things that fringe sites were saying that managed to go viral on Clinton. And then we can move on to look at Trump, and you can
Could,
see again.
sorry,
Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
could we go back for one moment to those, Ben? I just
Absolutely,
like,
yeah.
as we look at these, so we're looking at the most shared stories about Clinton from August to November 2016. So these are the
Yeah.
stories in the run up to the election. They're all, and this is out of everything. It's not just attack stories, right? This is any stories that
No, this
mention
is
her.
everything.
And
All the
it's
stories in our database. Yeah.
an amazingly negative list. It's a list, the only
Hmm.
publication that appears twice is endthefed.com.
Yeah.
Like,
Which is no longer online because they did their job and what they wanted to do. In a lot of these sites no longer exist because of the URL hopping that happens with misinformation. So they publish for a while, get called out as being misinformation, and then they disappear off the internet.
I don't know how you could, these aren't misinformation. It's just clear normal editorial positions, like a vote for Clinton is a vote for the New World Order and an end to the United States of America. So tell us how you really feel.
Yes, a perfectly normal thing. And then, sorry, did you have anything else you wanted to say on those, Paul?
No, but I think it's worth us just dwelling on that when we're comparing it in the future with what a list of, like, there's the Chicago Tribune is there, the Washington Post, with, but the Tribune is there saying Democrats should ask Clinton to step aside. So what a roster of stories. The notable things being the negativity and the weird sources. There's no New York Times, nothing like that. Really interesting.
Exactly. So, and then we can move on to Trump and look at, HillaryClinton.com is the top one, with her website saying that 5 living US presidents, none of them support Donald Trump. But a lot of these, again, are kind of fringe sites that are positive about Donald Trump. So there's a WordPress.com site in there that have had 1.5 million engagements on why they were voting for Donald Trump. And, things like ending the Fed again, supporting generals standing against Hillary Clinton and supporting Trump. Trump holding the flag for gay equality in the Washington Times. There's just a lot of positive articles there. And this is something we saw at the time and tried to highlight. But it went kind of under the radar, I think, until after the election happened. And then we looked back, and I think something like half the top stories about the 2016 election by our analysis were from iffy sites, as the University of Michigan might call it.
Yeah. I mean, I can see an out and out, and it became a very famous misinformation here with endingthefed.com's headline, Pope Francis endorses Donald Trump. And that became one of the famous examples, and fair enough, it's in the top 5. Some of the others are, you could say, maybe of questionable editorial quality, but not actually fake news, like, Hillary shot my husband. It's not, it's not, but it's very heavily editorialized and from low quality sites, is fair to say.
And that's fair. And I think especially when you go even beyond the top 10, some of these are kind of questionable. Some of them are definitely fake, but if you go beyond the top 10, it starts getting into kind of true conspiracy thinking, and the Clinton, all the conspiracies that went viral around, like Seth Rich and Clinton as part of a murder cult and whatever. These things all went viral in the run up to the 2016 election, and a lot of pro-Trump stuff went viral as well, either misrepresenting or taking really optimistic looks at his positions, for example, around like the military and LGBTQ plus rights, things like that. So because he didn't have a record in government, it was very easy to project one's own positions onto him and say, he doesn't have a record of doing this, so we can hope that he'll do this when he's in office. And when you've got 4 years of a record, that's less easy to do, and I think we'll see that in a minute.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's look ahead then to.
Let's do that. So this is Biden 2020, and this is in the last 3 months. First thing is just the level of engagement is just so much higher. There is still some attack stuff. So you've got your PJ Media in there, the infamous, I guess, New York Post story about Hunter Biden. The Free Beacons in there as well, attacking him. But there are notably a lot of mainstream outlets, and it's kind of around Kamala Harris mostly. 4 million engagements on the top story about Harris being selected as his VP there, and just a lot of excitement around that generally. And then more than 200 retired generals, in kind of the reverse of what we saw in the 2016 ones from NBC News, more than 200 retired generals and admirals endorsing Biden. So that's a huge shift.
When retired generals get together and take a position, it goes viral. It's interesting.
Yes, apparently, yeah. Whether in the fringe or in the mainstream, it's always interesting to people.
That's one for our communications professionals who are on the call.
Indeed.
So we've got, the New York Post was in the top 3 in the end. That was the famous story that was kind of suppressed in different ways on
allegedly,
yeah. And but as a result, or perhaps anyway, to get a lot of attention. But that's a very different. We've got Bearing Arms there. I guess, is PJ Media a satire site? Do you know, Ben?
They do some kind of sarcastic-y articles, but they also do just attack articles on Democrats a lot of the time. Yeah.
But we're looking
I
at
think this wasn't satire. I think this was just. I'm not actually sure on the details of that article, but they do some sarcastic articles, definitely. I think that particular one was taking some Biden comments on the climate out of context. But yeah.
Fair enough.
So,
okay.
Yeah. And then if we move on to Trump, I think this is where you can really mark the difference between 2016 and 2020, in that this is looking at pretty much Trump's record now in the mainstream, and that's what went viral, and hugely viral. So, you have this Atlantic article on Trump's alleged comments on people who died in war being losers and suckers. You have the New York Times story on his tax returns that they got a hold of. You have the coronavirus stuff, obviously, and things like that. So just huge scrutiny of his record, which just wasn't available and did not interest people in 2016.
Guys, there's not many positive stories in either. Well, there was for Trump and Kamala, I think, but here it's a very negative list. The numbers are much, much higher than 2016, as you've said. Now, Facebook's user base hasn't grown in line with that, right? This indicates higher intensity of usage, more sharing.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, it correlates, I think, with the fact that we're all more online now, for better or for worse. I mean, everyone's at home on their computer all day. So I think that's a big part of that. It had been something we've seen engagement going up anyway. Between 2016 and 2020, it's kind of doubled in many cases across all engagement, but particularly I think people are a lot more politically engaged as well, or engaged with political news in the last 4 years. I think there were a lot of people were not particularly engaged, and that showed in the voter counts. It showed in the amount of engagement to stories, apart from the people that were very highly engaged and pushing very specific narratives in 2016. I think the mainstream is much more highly engaged with the mainstream news consumer, rather, is much more highly engaged with politics now than they were 4 years ago.
And we see it's hard to quantify how much of that is the consumers and how much of it is actions taken as well by the social networks, right? Together, it looks like what's happening in the kind of the wider information sphere here is that the fights are taking place with a bit more of a factual underpinning. Like, I know in 2016, it seemed like completely different planets, much lower quality editorial was the most viral, whereas now there's a bit more of an established battleground, if you will, even if the perspectives of each side are very different.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You can kind of always tell who's going to be writing about which thing, and what it's kind of almost preordained in a lot of ways, but there are definitely established battlegrounds, as you say.
Very good. Okay, well, let's talk about the narratives as well then, Ben. I'm very interested to explore that.
So we did a big piece here a couple of weeks ago, just before the election, and we categorized the top stories about each candidate, looking at the top 1,000 articles and then just seeing what those articles were about. So for Donald Trump, there's a very clear narrative, I think. There was a lot of criticism of his response to the Black Lives Matter protests, some support among conservative media, especially around what to do with protesters that damage statues and such. There was some of that was pro-Trump's actions with that, but the vast majority, I think, was negative. Same to be said for the COVID response, lots and lots of criticism there. So 30% of the top articles were around those two topics, and then another 5% were about election integrity. So those were kind of the big topics about Trump. And then when I talk about election integrity, this is what I mean. So these were the top stories about election integrity. Anything where Trump suggested in advance that the election be delayed, or that people were put in positions to potentially undermine confidence in the results of the election, that went very viral. And I think we're maybe seeing the results of that now a bit, that people were very aware that Trump would dispute the results of the election, which is exactly what has happened. So maybe that's why it hasn't been perhaps as successful or as big a narrative in the mainstream as it might have been.
What's really interesting to see in this list as well is I thought election integrity would just be, I suppose, Trump and media that's sympathetic with Trump criticizing the election. But here we see US intelligence say Republicans are working with Russia to re-elect Trump. So I suppose when you look at integrity in the wider sense of whether there's foreign interference, then both sides have integrity narratives that that revolve around Trump.
No, exactly. And it's one of those things where, I mean, everyone was very switched on and focused on this very early, and the mainstream media, I think, made a point of looking at Trump's comments and not just ignoring them. In 2016, there was a lot of, you've got to take him seriously, not literally. And I think people began to take him literally. And that's been positive for coverage of the Trump White House, I think.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and we can look at Biden as well, obviously. And this will kind of develop into something we want to talk about more broadly around kind of polling and social media data. But this is the top 1,000 Biden articles. And as you can see, there's one very clear topic here, and that's endorsements. And that's endorsements from bureaucrats, from retired generals, as we talked about, and also endorsements from Republicans. There are things around the debates and Kamala Harris being picked as his VP, and accusations normally from conservative media about his family, etc. But it's really the endorsements that rang the most successful. And these are those endorsements. So some of these are someone endorsing Trump. So 50 Cent endorsed Trump after Biden's tax plan went viral. 50 Cent presumably makes more than $400,000 a year, although I don't know his personal finances. But you can see here, more than 100 former aides to John McCain endorsed Biden for president. Colin Powell announces he'll vote for Biden. And this is significant, I think, in the sense that when we're thinking about what this social data can tell us about the election, maybe, the fact that all these Republicans endorsed Biden rather, and then lots of Republicans outran Trump in many districts. You see from the main Senate election of Susan Collins, you see in Bucks County in Pennsylvania, which is a kind of a bellwether, the Republican House candidate won, but Trump lost. And the same in Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. That can tell us quite a lot about what people maybe intend to do. If enough people Colin Powell's endorsement is resonating with enough people, maybe that tells us something about the questions we should be asking in polling. And I think maybe, Paul, I don't know if you want to comment on this before we speak to that, but we can move on to talking about polling versus social data as well.
Yeah, I guess what always intrigues me when I look at a table like this is we're looking at millions of individual decisions to engage with content, hundreds of thousands of shares, many likes. So, when people choose, to share the retired generals and admirals endorsing Biden, what does that mean? And who are the people doing that sharing? They're people who respect the point of view of the military and are publicly aligning themselves and saying, well, this is happening and I respect these people's views. And you can see that be maybe more centrist, if you will, position to be kind of those kinds of shares could indicate that someone is starting to own more of the center as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I do think that's true. And for as much as there is an important conversation about the activists on the left and the right, a lot of the election is still decided by swing voters, right? Especially in the Senate, where there is a comparative advantage to being probably more centrist and being closer to the median person in your state. So I think that is super interesting. I think it's something we should talk about when we talk about polling. So Paul, you actually wrote an article on this and the utilities of polling versus social data. I know we want to leave time for questions, but maybe if you could just give a sense of your sense on that. When each is used.
let's do
I'm
that.
going to
And I
stop
think
sharing so that people can see our faces as we discuss this now.
great. So I was curious about, there was a lot of criticism I saw on Twitter of those who have been of the polls and the methodologies, and why couldn't they, especially when it looked like, at least one night when we all went to bed, it looked like Trump was going to be reelected. And there was a lot of gnashing of teeth and wondering how the polls could be so wrong. And I think, as in fairness, as you pointed out when we've talked about this before, Ben, the uh, the polling does allow for those possibilities, and it create scenarios, and they allow for the possibility that people aren't being either honest or correct in predicting their own actions when they say how they're going to vote. But what I was thinking about, well, what could we take from our data? And our data doesn't actually sample a sample of the population in the same way, and it doesn't let you infer a binary, this person's going to win or that person's going to win. And when we're looking back at a lot of these tables and this data, we can be a little bit, what is it called? Monday morning quarterbacks, right?
Yeah. Armchair quarterbacks. Monday. Oh no, Monday morning. You're right. Monday morning quarterbacks. That's right.
On the flip side, though, when you dig into our data, you also see a lot of richness about which narratives actually matter, which could be massively important for messaging, which journalists are the ones getting shared, which outlets are the ones getting shared. So while, I think our data can give you, it's a little hard to answer a really closed binary forward-looking question like how people will vote, or is this better than that? You can then instead explore what are the stories that are motivating people around that thing. And I think those are harder questions to phrase sometimes. You have to turn it into keywords. You have to explore, okay, well, this is what people are saying on Reddit. What does it mean if the most shared stories are the admirals or something like that? There's a little bit of interpretation, but it's really, really rich and a lot cheaper and more incremental than polling. And that's what I was trying to get across in the article, I think. And when you put the two together, it could be quite powerful. And I think communications where you combine focus groups and a bit of polling and direct market research with looking at what people are sharing and all of their social behavior, you get quite a rich picture.
Yeah, I think Axios did a piece on this morning, actually, that's very interesting, and I think Danielle was going to share it. But the point being that people are very, eventually, especially in their in-groups online, people are very honest in what they comment on a Facebook post, whereas they might not be honest to an anonymous, that's a hard word to say on Friday morning, pollster. And I think what you pointed out in the article that I think really resonated with me was it's the use of social data to frame how we think about polling. So we're not just picking questions out the air that we assume are going to be interesting to people and to resonate with people, but we're using social data to narrow down how we think about the questions that we want to ask. So, to narrow it down to that binary of, who are you going to vote for, Biden or Trump? But is the question, how much does the endorsement of some generals matter to you? Like, it's really good to think about that, and also to think about messaging and like what exact words people want to use on the other side of things, maybe on the campaign side of things. Does whatever Medicare for all resonate more than public option, and why, and who's commenting, who's sharing, which audience is it resonating with? I think that's a super interesting way of framing questions so that we can then ask that question of a specified subset of the population.
Wow, you phrased it much better than I can. Thanks, Ben.
Not at all.
I would love to see if we have any questions from our attendees. If any of our participants want to
do
put their
some
hands up.
questions in. I'd love to see them. I see Danielle's shared a lot of pieces. The PJ Media piece, by the way, did get its own Snopes shout out of debunking. So that's thanks for sharing that, Josh.
Okay, I've
Any
got
questions? You've got a
questions.
question? Okay,
Yes.
cool.
And if anyone wants to, so the way to ask a question, there should be a chat in the bottom, and you can ask it to the panelists or to all attendees, and we can all see the question, and both are good. So how often would you say influencers project an opinion rather than reflect an opinion?
It's a good question. I think, well, to kind of not sidestep the question, but take it on a slightly different tangent there, what we have seen is a lot of influencers asking people to vote either way, but to register to vote, and huge engagement, especially on Instagram, asking people to vote. And some influencers, so the likes of Jennifer Aniston, Taylor Swift, got huge engagements on endorsements of Biden and Harris. But really, the big thing we saw from the likes of the Kardashians, the Jenners, was just encouraging people to vote one way or the other. And I think that's fair to say that's projecting an opinion that people should vote. It's not taking a side, but it is pushing forward, civic duty and all that, which is interesting in its own way, because I don't know that was super common before 2018 at the earliest. Among singers, for example. I mean, Taylor Swift famously, I think, sat out the endorsement rounds of the 2016 election and got a lot of criticism for it. And then this time she's been very vocal. So
I see another question from Dev. Is noting that there was a lot more factually incorrect information in 2016 than in 2020. So why is this the misinformation election? That question first, like what I would say is, no, 2016 was the misinformation election. It's just no one knew it was. People who read the New York Times and NBC were in one bubble, and they had no idea that endthefed.com was being shared by millions of people in a different bubble. Until everyone woke up one morning, or even one evening in November. And I think people are just hyper conscious of it now. But the misinformation levels, if we were to look at the top stories, even we started tracking the levels of misinformation among the most shared stories in the run up to different elections. Facebook started clamping down very quickly in 2017, and in the UK, French and German elections of 2017, misinformation dropped precipitously from the highs of the 2016 US presidential election. Would you add any comment to that, Ben?
I would just say that I think misinformation has changed since 2016 as well. The platforms really don't allow you to just make false claims that go super viral anymore. So I think, now it's much more missing context or headlines that don't reflect the full story or things like that. And that is something we've seen. We've seen recently there's been a lot of stuff that's right. So there was an article this morning about a Pennsylvania judge saying that some ballots had to be thrown out, which is true, but it's such a low number of ballots that it doesn't matter to the result of the election. But the way people read the headline, if they don't read the story, tells a very different story and thus goes viral. And I think probably says a lot about how many people actually read stories versus headlines. But yeah, I think it was about the deadline being rolled back 3 days for ballots to be corrected, which affects like ballots in the order of the hundreds rather than the thousands needed to overturn any result. But because there's this narrative of push by some of a stolen election, that kind of stuff goes viral. So we probably need a better term for misinformation. I think a lot of misinformation writers have kind of pointed that out. Maybe it's clickbait again. Maybe we're going back to clickbait or engagement bait.
I think, and what you said there as well, it answers, David, a follow-up question. You've answered it a bit there, which is that when there's that little kernel of actual information, that's where the misinformation gets the most dangerous. And the WHO and people advising the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation use our technology. And what they're the most worried about is the misinformation where there's kind of a kernel of truth, or it's some out of context thing that Bill Gates said in a speech once, or it's there is that one vote that was spoiled or thrown out or something. And then that can enable something to really take off and break out of the real the real activist groups and into the mainstreams. And I think both foreign actors probably have done that, but normal motivated people are very good at doing that themselves too.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, that's true. All right, looks like we're at time.
We're at
That flew
time.
by.
Thanks, folks. We're going to be posting this on YouTube next week. Really appreciate you joining. It's been a really great session, and there's going to be a blog post on the narrative themes coming out shortly, right, Ben?
Yeah, so we have the blog post on the 2020 narrative themes. I'm going to post one on the 2016 election and what went viral, and then also looking at what went from the conservative sites to the mainstream as well. So looking at like Hillary's emails versus the Hunter Biden stuff and what was covered and engaged. So that'll be out next week.
Great. Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much, Ben. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.